Every so often in a genre, there's an artist that comes along and just completely blows everything else out of the water and reinvents the sound for themselves. In some cases, this can lead to entire subgenres being born, or at least evolves the existing one, but other times that isn't the case at all, and the artist then becomes a standalone gem in a sea of others that for the most part sound relatively similar. Of course, both of these scenarios have happened more than a few times in punk rock, and the list of standalones goes on for pages. But if we were to zero in on the mid-2000s, I feel like there's only a handful of those bands, and most of them remain relatively obscure. How's it going, folks? My name is Jack Miller. I am the incredibly underqualified punk historian, and it has been far too long since we've talked pop punk on this channel, so I am very excited to dive back into the subject with a band that holds a special place in my heart, the Ergs. For those of you who don't know, the Ergs are a three-piece pop-punk band that developed a cult following after leaving a mark on the genre with a one-of-a-kind sound that really hasn't been replicated by anyone else ever since. So in addition to giving you all the standard history lesson and some of my personal feelings towards the band, I also want to share some of my thoughts as to why I think the Ergs are such a cult favorite, but no one has even come close to replicating their sound. Before we dive in though, I thought I'd let you all know that I made a playlist of some of my favorite songs by the Ergs and the many bands associated with them, and I'll be sure to link that in the description below. And lastly, if you are interested in weekly videos about punk rock, may I humbly ask that you please subscribe to my channel here. I'm having a lot of fun making these, and I want to make sure that all of you can keep having fun watching them. Anyways, the story of the Ergs begins in the town of South Amboy, New Jersey in the year 2000. Founding members Mike Yannick, Jeff Stroke, and Joe Keller were attending Old Bridge High School, and after the breakup of their first band, they decided to continue on playing as a three-piece. Although their sound was heavily rooted in the old-school pop-punk styles of bands like the Ramones, the Descendants, and Green Day, the Ergs expressed a great deal of fondness for other genres through their songwriting, incorporating elements of jazz, garage rock, 80s hardcore, and much more. In fact, bassist Joey Erg has even stated that jazz saxophonist and composer John Coltrane's album Giant Steps was one of the band's biggest inspirations, and that they've always strived to make music that is, as he puts it, more than just punk. After formation, the Ergs then recorded their first two demo CDs titled Effin' and Digital Endpoints and started gigging their asses off around the New Jersey area. The two demos were the first of many releases and songs to feature the Ergs' signature sense of humor and contained a great deal of pop culture references and puns in the titles and lyrics, along with sampled audio clips from movies, TV shows, and other forms of media in between songs. The early material also established Mikey Ergs' My Heart's Cut in Half lyrical themes that would become a staple of the band's music along with their often ambitious instrumentals. Unfortunately, the recordings from these demos are pretty hard to find, but I assembled what I could scare up on YouTube into a playlist, and I'll link that in the description below. Huge shout out to the channel The Clash 57. Anyways, once the Ergs had refined their powerhouse of an act a little bit, they set out on their first ever tour with fellow NJ pop punkers Dirt Bike Annie, a band that drummer-vocalist Mikey Erg would later end up joining. I do want to point out that around this time, the ferociously talented Mikey Erg was already making a name for himself as one of the best drummers in the tri-state punk scene, and it wasn't long until he had bands from all over New York and New Jersey knocking on his door with a recording contract in one hand and keys to their practice space in the other. After building up a decent following in their local scene along with a few small tours, the New York-based Whoa Records took an interest in the Ergs very early on in their career. Then after joining the label's roster, the band quickly got to work on their first 7-inch EP, 3 Guys, 12 Eyes, which I can only assume is a pun about wearing glasses. The band then followed up with the self-released Ben Queller EP in 2002, that's artwork, title, and many of its song lyrics reference the indie rock musician Ben Queller, but in a non-satirical manner despite many perceiving it that way. Now with 2 official releases under their belt, the Ergs shot back out on the road with their label mates Charlie Brown Gets a Valentine in late spring of 2003. They called the tour the Who Grabbed My Ass Tour, and the bands made it all the way to Missouri before heading back up to the Northeast for the tour's final show with Dirt Bike Annie. The Ergs would put out one more EP in 2003 titled Cotton Pickin' Minute before they hit the studio again at the end of the year to record their debut full-length Dork Rock Cork Rod. Recording for Dork Rock began in late 2003 at Technical Ecstasy Studios with the help of producer Chris Pierce. After mixing and mastering, the album was first released through Whoa in June 2004 and would later be reissued on vinyl through Don Giovanni Records in 2005. Following the album's release, the Ergs continued to play shows to a rapidly growing fan base. One of those fans happened to be nerd rapper and Adult Swim contributor MC Chris, who invited the Ergs onto his 2.5-month Revenge of the Nerd tour in the summer of 2005 along with the indie rock band S&M and M&M. Prior to heading out on tour, the band recorded the song All Kids Out of the Pool, which was used in one of Adult Swim's promo spots. This song isn't available on streaming, so I'll leave a link to it in the description below, but just a heads up, it doesn't sound anything like their usual stuff. Before 2005 ended, the Ergs would release a split EP with the band Modern Machines through Grateful Records, and would also contribute 2 songs to the Art of the Underground singles series sometime in early 2006. Like I mentioned earlier, the Ergs were not the only band Mikey Erg was a part of in the early 2000s. and at the ripe age of 26, Mr. Erg had acquired 5 more bands, including Dirt Bike Annie, The Measure, and the Unlovables. He would also record drums for folk punk singer-songwriter Brooke Pridemore's album First Name Last Name in 2004. Anyways, the Ergs would return to technical ecstasy once more in the spring of 2006 and released a 7-song EP titled Jersey's Best Prancers. The album title and artwork parodied New Jersey punk band Lifetime's 1997 release Jersey's Best Dancers and remains one of the more popular releases in the Ergs catalog. After the success of Prancers, the Ergs shot back out on the road again with Hunchback on a tour they called the Discovering America Tour. They would also enter the studio again, this time in Seattle, Washington, and with seasoned producer Conrad Uno began working on their second full-length album, Upstairs Downstairs. The record would be released through the Portland-based label Dirt Nap Records on May 15, 2007. The album's closing title track features a noisy, Fugazi-esque instrumental ending and holds the record for the band's longest track at nearly 20 minutes in length. Despite the unconventional ender, though, the rest of the record is made up entirely of the Ergs' garagey, jazzy pop-punk touch, and fans and critics alike absolutely loved it. The record was even named the punk record to beat this year by Alternative Press later in 2007. Along with the full-length, the Ergs also released a split with the New York indie rock band Lemuria to coincide with their full US tour together. The band would also take part in several other performances and tours in 2007, including one with Lifetime and the Bouncing Souls called the Generations of Punk Rock in New Brunswick and New Jersey at Large tour. They would then release 3 more 7-inch EPs before the year was over and finished everything off with a tour supporting the Loved Ones and the Gaslight Anthem. The Ergs would bust through into 2008 with another year booked full of tour dates and recording sessions. Their first release of the year would be a split with Teenage Bottle Rocket that featured both bands covering a song of their choice. Later that year, the band would also re-release their collection of singles and B-sides from previous years on a compilation titled Hindsight is 2020, my friend. Following the release of the comp, the Ergs hit the road again with their friends in Hunchback. Despite the success of the tour, though, they decided it was time to call it quits and announced that they would be breaking up shortly after the tour's end. They would of course complete their pre-scheduled tour plans and also booked a few additional farewell shows. Their final run of shows included a tour with Less Than Jake and Bomb the Music Industry, 2 shows at the Chicago Riot Fest, and another tour supporting Dillinger 4. The Ergs' first 2 farewell shows took place at the 7th Annual Fest in Gainesville, Florida, and the band performed Dork Rock Cork Rod in its entirety during the second set. They would play 4 final shows after that one of which was a surprise performance at a Lemuria show in New Jersey. After that, they would release a 7-inch titled That's It, Bye in late 2008 before they finally parted ways at the end of the year. As I'm sure many of you know, this was certainly not the end-all for the Ergs, and they would have several reunions over the course of the 2010s. The first Ergs reunion happened in 2010 when the band played 2 one-off shows with Hunchback to raise money for the mother of Hunchback's bass player. This reunion coincided with other fundraising events, including a solo performance by Mikey Erg in Jersey City. They would also perform as the backing band for punk rock karaoke the following December in 2011, but I wouldn't really consider this a reunion as they didn't actually play any of their songs. Their next reunion would not arrive until 2016 when they announced they would be headlining Fest's 15th anniversary. They would also do a performance on the Chris Gethard Show to promote their reunion shows at the festival. The Ergs also released a 4-song EP in 2016 titled Goddamn Death Dedication. The album featured a song written by each member along with a cover of the Knack's My Sharona. I actually had the pleasure of seeing their reunion performance at Fest that year. Not only are the Ergs one of the best live bands I've ever seen, but I can vividly remember running back over to the stage after puking from heat stroke. As someone from the Pacific Northwest, I guess I wasn't quite ready for the Florida heat. Since then, the Ergs have done a whole bunch of one-off shows throughout the country, including one at the Seattle Pop Punk Fest before COVID that I will probably regret not going to for the rest of my life. The 3 members have also had a ton of different projects throughout the years, and although I've already mentioned a few, this video would not be complete without a quick rundown segment on that. If you're familiar with the Ergs at all, I'm sure you're at least somewhat aware of the massive list of bands and musicians Mikey Erg has collaborated with. But just to name a few of the more notable ones, he's played drums with the Dopamines, Warriors, the Unlovables, and Starfucking Hipsters. He's also released a fair amount of solo music, and he actually just put out a self-titled album this year in 2021. I also want to mention Joey Erg's band, the Nightbirds, who don't really sound anything like the Ergs. They actually sound a lot more like Bad Brains, but you should absolutely check them out if you like old school punk. They're fucking awesome. And finally, to round everything off, Jeff Erg's band, Black Wine, which has more of a grungy Nirvana, Bikini Kill type of sound, is definitely worth a listen to. So like I said earlier, the Ergs have a rabid cult following, but they don't really have any doppelganger bands, and I wanted to offer some of my thoughts as to why I think that is. The Ergs are a prime example of a band that's made up entirely of extremely talented musicians with their own ideas and influences, and when everything comes together, it creates this really raw, organic energy that most bands could only dream of capturing. Plus, you might see a little bit of crossover between the fan bases of pop punk, 80s hardcore, garage rock, math rock, and jazz, but it's not like there's hundreds of people ready to dive into a musical project that indirectly fuses all five, let alone 3 of them in the same town with the raw talent to do so in an effective manner. Other cult favorite punk bands like Choking Victim, Propagandhi, Dillinger 4, or even the Ramones might have spawned a lot more doppelganger bands, yes, but if you really think about it, each of those bands has a much more straightforward influence pool and a songwriting style that's a lot easier to emulate. By no means am I trying to say this makes the Ergs or other standalone bands like them any better or worse than others who've left marks on the genre with more straightforward ideas, because which band is better just ultimately comes down to who you ask and what's important to them as a listener. That being said, I think part of the reason the Ergs and other standalones aren't as big as their trend-setting counterparts is actually because of the complexity of their songwriting. At least in the case of the Ergs, there's all kinds of musical elements packed into each different song in a rather sporadic manner that varies from track to track. Things like atypical song structures and unusual transitions are also super common, and even to someone who listens to bands from a similar scene like D4 or None More Black might have a hard time getting it at first, especially if they're not used to listening to complicated music. I'm actually a perfect example of that too. I first heard the Ergs when I was like 15, and I was super into bands like The Loved Ones, Lifetime, and Alkaline Trio, and I didn't really know what to think of them at first. It wasn't until I was a little older and I'd had some time to grow as a listener that I could truly appreciate the Ergs music for what it is. That being said, I fucking love the Ergs. Like I mentioned before, I flew all the way out to Gainesville when they played Fest in 2016, and holy shit was that a show. I really hope I get another chance to see them at some point, especially since they played Seattle Pop Punk Fest before COVID and I didn't end up catching their set. Nonetheless, I would definitely put them in my top 10 pop punk bands of all time, and if I had to pick a favorite release from them, it would probably be Dork Rock Cork Rod, and that's partially because I bought that LP at a record store in Gainesville just before their show. Anyways, I think that about covers everything to do with the Ergs. I have to say I've had a blast revisiting their music this week while I was making this video, and I seriously don't know why I don't listen to them all the time. But that's enough for me. I want to hear what you guys have to say. What are some of your favorite Ergs songs? Do you have a favorite album from them, or maybe a favorite associated side project? Let me know in the comments. Thanks a lot for watching. I'll see you next time.